Welcome, Stay Spiritual team, to part 2 of our series on understanding Islam, what most people misunderstand. Now, this isn't a conventional video on Islam. It's a little bit different, so we always like to put out a little bit of like a trigger warning at the beginning if this isn't your cup of tea. But from the last video that we did, we had some really good, intelligent comments, a lot of maturity. People said like, look, I see half-truths here. I see some things that I like, some things that I don't agree with. And then they explained, their thing. Beautiful, great comments. We totally encourage that stuff. It's awesome. And we just like to, for our audience that likes to think outside of the box, we love putting out these types of videos. So that's what we're doing. We won't keep you guys waiting. Let's get into this part 2.
Traditions through many other forms, including in Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, yoga, Zen. I mean, you name it, there's so many. Shamanism, psychedelics, just plain old-fashioned contemplation or meditation can get you there. There's so many ways to get there. Islam is certainly not the way, not the best way, and not the only way. Another interesting concept that I love in Islam is this notion of the 72 virgins. Have you heard of this? You heard of terrorists expecting 72 virgins after they blow themselves up and this sort of stuff? And that might seem like, well, it's just some silly nonsense. How could anybody believe that and then blow themselves up over that? But actually, after you experience Allah directly for yourself, you will understand that this 72 virgins is a very accurate metaphor for the magnificence of Allah. What you have to understand is you have to understand where Islam came from, its cultural context, its historical context. This metaphor of the 72 virgins is perfect for the context in which Allah was developed. When was Allah developed? Where was it developed? Not in America, not in the 21st century with the internet and with television and with video games, okay? This was developed in 600 AD in Arabia. Do you know, have you studied the history of 600 AD Arabia? Do you know the kind of things that went on there? Do you know the kind of mindsets that that culture had? What their values were? Take a hypothetical Arabian man in 600 AD, a wealthy man. He's probably a caravan trader, let's say, and he delivers spices along the Silk Road and other places through the Middle East. Maybe he trades with people in Africa and Europe and in India. And so he's a business person. He's a trader. He has a caravan. He has a big family he has to take care of. He probably has multiple wives, as was the custom of that time. He has to take care of all of them. He has to take care of his thriving caravan trade. And he's interested in what? What is he interested in? He's interested in acquiring more wives. He's interested in beautiful horses. He's interested in finding new spices and new trade routes and acquiring gold and trading. He's engaged in the pragmatics of living back then. That's how people lived. He's also concerned about tribal warfare because the region he lived in, and at that time, tribal warfare was rampant. There were feuds between neighboring tribes and even large families because Arabian culture is a strongly familial culture. Family is very, very important. It's one of the most important values. But then, of course, they have family feuds. They have these long extended families, so they're battling with each other. So that's what his mind is focused upon. Now, let's say that I am some Arabian prophet who has experienced Allah, and now I come to this Arabian businessman, this caravan trader, and I tell him, hey, there's this magnificent thing called Allah. You've got to experience this. Come with me. Start meditating. Here's some practices. Start to do this, and you will experience Allah, the most magnificent thing. And the Arabian man will look at me and say, the caravan trader will say, but, I mean, how is this going to improve my life? How is this practical? This isn't practical at all. Is this going to get me more camels? Is it going to get me better horses? Is this going to get me more women for my harem? Is this going to get me more spices? Is this going to help? How's this going to help me with the feuds that I'm fighting with? I need warriors for my feuding. And that's where I will come up with a metaphor to help to explain to him the magnificence of the absolute. And I will say, you know what it's like? Allah is like 72 virgins. It's like having 72 virgins in your harem. And now the caravan trader will get it. That's a metaphor he can relate to in his time, in his culture, in the stuff that he's engaged in at the time. Now, of course, today in the West, in the 21st century, this doesn't make any sense. But back then, in that context, it made perfect sense.
Okay. I'm glad you paused it because I felt the need to, we weren't going to do it. I felt the need to say something too, but go.
I was just going to point out that Leo's got tears in his eyes as he's discussing this.
Yeah.
Okay? I don't know if you don't know who this guy is. He's worked very hard to try to get in touch with what mystic people and spiritual people and religious people have talked about, some of the highest degrees of consciousness and experiences that you can have. What is the term in Islam? The hour of power.
Yeah.
Think of it in terms of somebody trying to attain the hour of power, or somebody trying to, from a charismatic, what are they called? Charismatic Christian, fervent Christian, trying to attain baptism by fire, like baptized in the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
This is what this man has been after, and I've seen him talk about some of the experiences he's had with getting in touch with the divine, getting in touch with God, and I recognize that twinkle in his eyes when he even mentions, when he talks about the why it's an astute comparison, why it's an astute, what is it called, like a metaphor.
Yeah.
And you can see that there's tears in his eyes. That's coming from a place of earnestness. Now, you can't stop somebody that's going to look at that and go, yeah, that's how grifters work, or that's how deluded people work.
Yeah.
But I've been watching this guy for a hell of a long time, over 10 years now.
Yeah.
And I recognize that glimmer in his eyes and actually the little bit of tears in his eyes, because he understands that connection with God or an experience of God has an emotional reaction that way. And it's an astute, and whatever your thing is, forget the 72 virgins. Whatever your version of utter fulfillment and peace and completion would be, to make you cry, to make you cry tears of joy.
That's what Allah is. And very interesting, like he was like, it is like, he was using that term, it is like, and I was reminded of like one of the parables, I think, that Jesus talked about, how the guy who tripped over like the chest, the treasure chest in the field, and then went and sold everything he had so he could go back and have that, you know, to have that treasure chest.
Yes.
It was ringing bells.
Yes.
The metaphor is there, but it's like the thing that you give up everything to go get for once you've gleaned the value, like once you've understood the value of what is here.
So compelling that you don't go and knock door to door because you're obligated to. You run around the town like a Ebenezer Scrooge after his night of visited by ghosts and proclaim that life is beautiful. You don't realize it. Buy the biggest turkey in the window and let's celebrate. That kind of life-changing experience.
And if you ever happen to have the glory of experiencing Allah for yourself, you will actually see that it's more magnificent than having 72 virgins in a harem. I'm telling you, that's a dead accurate metaphor, and actually, it will be way better than that. Experience it for yourself, and then you will see how appropriate that metaphor is. The mistake that people make when they are thinking about religion and spiritual and mystical traditions is that they take them out of the historical and cultural context, especially today because we have a global world. And it might seem, because our world is global and you can watch YouTube videos from around the world and the internet connects us all, that, now we sort of understand each other globally. But no, we don't. We really don't. Because, first of all, you don't understand even a fraction, not even 1% of the cultures that exist around the world today in the 21st century. You don't understand. You have no experience with them at all. and they would completely blow your mind and shatter your reality if you were exposed to them. And that's not even taking into account the historical evolution of cultures that happened over centuries and millennia, like we're talking about here. See? So you have to understand where the tradition is coming from, what its origins were, and then it starts to make a lot more sense. Another interesting facet of Islam is that there are no images of Allah or Muhammad within Islam. This is very different from the Christian tradition, where we actually have art going back for centuries and for millennia, depictions of Christ and Mary and even God, Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, where you have David and God, or Adam and God, and all this, and they have depictions of God as the white, in the white flowing robes and the white beard, sitting up in the heavens with angels and all this sort of stuff. You don't get that in Islam. And actually, Islam is very sensitive to that, which you might have heard about in the news. People fighting with violence over cartoon drawings of Muhammad and all this sort of stuff. But what's the deeper truth there? Why is Allah and Muhammad not allowed to be depicted? Why is there a taboo against imagery in Islam? Because the map is not the territory. Because the mind gets hooked on images and icons, and then it starts to worship those images and those icons. But Allah is not any particular image or icon or form. Allah is the formless. Allah is nothingness. Infinity is nothingness. So in a sense, to maintain the purity of the teaching, you don't want to corrupt the teaching by putting pictures of Allah everywhere, or Muhammad, because people will then start to worship that, rather than seeing Allah as what's here right now in the present moment. And that's been a big problem for Christianity. The iconography within Christianity, arguably, all the European art that's been done over the last 1,000 years around Christianity, has done a great disservice to Christianity, because most people today, most Christians, when you ask them what is God, they have an image of God as this man sitting up in the clouds. And that's a delusion. And they don't understand that's a delusion. So you can see that actually there's a good intention behind this idea of not depicting Allah or Muhammad, because all symbols are not the absolute. And we've talked about that a lot before. So you can appreciate that. You can appreciate how all my talking about the map is not the territory and Gödel's incompleteness theorem and all this, how it all starts to connect together. What they do have in Islam, though, for art is they have geometric patterns. These sort of tessellations or these fractals. Interesting and various geometric patterns. That, in a sense, is one way to depict Allah without creating a human image of it, without anthropomorphizing Allah, the way that Christians do. And it's actually a pretty ingenious solution to this problem. These geometric patterns actually align very well with what you see on psychedelics. And also, they represent infinity, because once you have a checkerboard, some other kind of pattern, hexagonal pattern, it just kind of goes on in all directions infinitely. And that is a symbol, a pointer towards Allah. Another feature of Islam is that they pray 5 times a day. Why 5 times a day? Why so much? Well, it's because of this important other concept within Islam, which is called forgetfulness. Islam recognizes, as basically all spiritual traditions do, the fact that we fall back asleep so easily. The human mind falls back asleep into complacency and into materialism. And so what needs to be happening is you need to be waking up all the time. You don't just have one enlightenment experience and that's it. It's like you got to be awake all the time, 5 times a day. 20 times a day. Keep waking yourself up. Keep being mindful because you forget. And if you had a mystical experience of your own, maybe you take a psychedelic trip, or maybe you've had some awakening experience during a meditation retreat or something like that, great. But then you know what the problem is. The problem is you come back the next day and you've forgotten. Where did it go? Where did my mystical experience go? How come I'm not in union anymore? How come I don't see Allah right now? How come I'm out of touch with it? Because you've forgotten. Not forgotten in the sense that you can't remember, but you've lost touch with the awareness right now. You've gone from mindfulness into mindlessness, and now you're in mindlessness. And so the point of prayer 5 times a day is so that you don't get so wrapped up in your day doing practical stuff, materialistic stuff, the way that most Westerners do. Think of a typical Westerner stockbroker on Wall Street. What's he doing his whole day? He's chasing money and sex and drugs. That's what he's doing all day. And power and political influence. So the intention behind Islam is like, well, what if we interrupted his day 5 times and got him to actually focus on the more subtle, the more spiritual aspects of life? Like, for example, what if we just took a stockbroker and we forced him to stop 5 times a day, because we had a clock that just rang for everybody. So all of Wall Street would just stop 5 times a day for 10 minutes, and every single stockbroker on Wall Street, they thought about their own death, they thought about the suffering of humanity, they thought about what they're doing with their life, and whether their pursuit of materialistic goods and pleasures is leading them towards actual happiness. And they calmed their mind down. And they stepped outside of their cravings and all the stuff they're chasing, the hustle and bustle of everyday life, of all the practical stuff, and they just basked in the beingness of the present moment. What would happen then? Well, of course, then all of Wall Street would collapse after a few years of that. So that's no good, so we can't have that on Wall Street. But you understand the intention now. A little bit about Muhammad. Muhammad is the prophet. He's supposed to have written the Quran, but he didn't write it himself. He's supposed to have channeled it from a higher source. The question is, was Muhammad enlightened? And I think almost certainly he was. The only question is to what degree. There are various degrees of enlightenment, various degrees of realization, various facets of realization that you can become conscious of. I don't know. It's hard to judge. But since he spoke about the absolute so eloquently, and since it seems like he had an understanding of the absolute from direct experience, I don't see otherwise how he could have spoken it with such passion and such commitment, that it seems like he was enlightened. He did go and meditate in a cave by himself. That's part of his origin story. And it seems like he had mystical experiences throughout his whole life. Not just once or twice, but later, into his later years, he basically composed the Quran and other writings for like 20 or 30 or 40 years of his life. He lived a pretty long life after his initial I would consider an awakening. He's also supposed to have communicated or channeled the angel Gabriel. And you might say, well, that's surely nonsense, Leo. That's just stories. That's just fiction. Don't be so sure about that. As you get deeper into these mystical experiences, you start to discover that you can channel entities. I've got books on my bookshelf that teach you how to channel. If you want to learn how to channel, you can go spend 30, 60 days doing these practices. You can learn how to channel. You can connect with different entities and this sort of stuff. You can take DMT and you can see alien entities and they will be more lifelike than human beings that you see right here, right now. And you could find YouTube videos of people who channel, like you got Bashar and other folks like that who are into channeling. So channeling's a real phenomenon. You can go learn it, experience it for yourself. It's definitely possible. It's a common ability that gets developed by people who do serious, hardcore spiritual practices. So,
all right, we're working our way through this. Some wild stuff. I'm curious with the Muslim community out there, what they think about channeling. I'm sure from a traditional standpoint, it might be looked as like a form of witchcraft.
What do you think of channeling? Would you channel? Somebody was like, in 5 days, I'll teach you how to. Another entity will embody your body, and you'll take a back seat. You'll be like, imagine sitting on a stool behind in your own mind while something else is running the shots in your body. Yeah. Does that sound appealing to you, or sort of creepy?
Yeah, it sounds scary. It does sound scary and creepy. I like more of the idea of like being in control of a situation like that. I am curious about it. Like, I wouldn't not read a book about it. Or
I wouldn't not speak in tongues when no one's looking and chant and shake and do all kinds of things and talk in different voices. I wouldn't not do those things. Yeah. Because in my opinion, you're already kind of there's not just one entity behind any normal, healthy, sane human's mind. Yeah. I think that you're kind of like a tribe of entities. Most people are. So it's not that, but
with the characters and stuff that they embody through their ego and stuff.
Yeah, like everybody's got like an angry side that show different people, and then what they're like behind when no one's looking. Yeah, everybody's got sort of like multiple identities already, in my opinion. Yeah. But something about channeling, like inviting something that didn't grow from within you, some outside thing in, seems a little bit dangerous or something, doesn't it?
Yeah, also kind of off, especially if you're coming from the non-dual perspective. It's all supposed to be one anyway, so what the hell's embodying you but you?
Right? More of you.
Fascinating stuff. I like what he said kind of about the art piece. It's like hidden Easter eggs almost found within Islam. Like within the art, it's like we don't draw Muhammad. We don't do that, but we have all these intricate artworks within our architecture that kind of like point towards the infinite, point towards God. And you see it in sometimes some of these mosques and stuff. The beauty, like there are some like gorgeous mosques out there where they're like the art, the time that would have like taken to like put these details into the stuff. It's pretty wild.
Yeah, it's funny because in the Western Christian religion type thing, a lot of the iconography, like a lot of the imagery you get is like
yeah. You know
what I mean? And when you're going into, let's say, a psychedelic trip, I don't know if you want to see like you know, something, or it'd be nice to have a heads up of some of the bizarre things you'll see, like geometric patterns or checkerboard, you know? Yeah. If you had no reference, if you didn't go to church first and see that, like, you know, like those geometric patterns, and this was your first shocking psychedelic experience, and all of a sudden it's Alice in Wonderland spiraling fractal checker patterns, you're like, oh! You know, it can be very shocking. Maybe it's helpful to already realize, have the association in your mind that this is involved with the divine. This sacred geometry is already divine. This is what the spiritual realm is like. But coming from someone that's used to this, to checkerboard, you know, like it's too bizarre. It's too foreign, you know. So in some sense, it might be conducive. Like it might be helpful to already have your mind associate with some of those patterns.
Yes, I agree. All right. Well, anyway, we continue on.
Totally plausible that that's how the Quran came about. I encourage you to actually go study the origin story of Muhammad. Not per se the myths of it, but like the historical, like what are the historical facts that we know? Just to kind of like get inside his head to see where he was coming from. And also to learn about the culture and the context that he was dealing with at that time. It's very eye-opening. I want to stress that you don't get lost in the minutia of debating about the niggly little details about Islam. That's very easy to do. It's very easy to do that with almost anything. You can always find fine points to criticize here and there and different things that are corrupt here and there. Oh, I don't like this. I don't like that. Is this really true? Is this an embellishment? Is this an elaboration? Is this a thing a lie? Yeah, there's probably plenty of that in Islam. But you want to go to the big picture. Because what happens otherwise is that you're lost in the minutia. The people, most of the Westerners who like to debate and criticize Islam do so without ever having a direct experience of Allah, which is utterly absurd because you can't criticize this thing. You can't really understand what this thing is about without having a direct experience of Allah first. So first go experience that, then start leveling your criticisms. So people like Bill Maher, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, and others like that, they love to criticize and rag on Islam, but they've never actually experienced Allah. So they don't really understand the depth of what they're criticizing. which is not to say that all their criticisms are invalid. Some of their criticisms are totally valid. It's completely correct that modern-day Islam and countries and people who subscribe to Islam, that those people do all sorts of violations of human rights and civil rights, and they can form dictatorial regimes, and they can do all sorts of nasty stuff. Of course. But that's not exclusive just to them. That happens everywhere, all around the world. There's corruption all around the world. Every single government is basically corrupt. Especially the U.S. government is extremely corrupt, and we do all sorts of heinous things against all sorts of people in the name of American patriotism, in the name of Christianity, in the name of Judaism, in the name of anything. Because that's ego. That's how ego functions. That's not a problem of Islam. That's a problem of ego. It's a problem of dogma and fundamentalism. Now you might ask, well, Leo, why is Islam so corrupt? Why is it so archaic? You have to understand that every spiritual teaching has to be suited to the era, the culture, and the geography from which it came about. This spiritual teaching, as I've said, is suited to 600 AD Arabia. If Islam was invented today, it would look like actualize.org. It would not look like traditional Islam. And conversely, if actualize.org was invented in 600 AD Arabia, for that era, for that geography, for that culture, it would look something like Islam. Because if I try to say the things that I'm trying to say now, there, in that era, it would completely not resonate, and I would get killed. And also because I would have grown up in that culture, so I would have a totally different set of values than I do as an American in the 21st century. And also, of course, because we knew a lot less about the world than we know now.
So that's an interesting point he just made. What would it look like now? It would look like actualize.org. This video is 7 years old.
Yeah.
So 7 years, and a lot's changed on this channel since then. He posts pretty infrequently now.
Yeah.
So it went from being what Islam would look like today to 7 years later. The posts are fewer now.
Yeah.
Still very long when he does post them. Like over an hour long usually.
Yeah.
But I wonder what 7 years later Islam would look like.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. No, I like what he said.
I don't want to be mean. These Islamic people watching this are going, "We're still it, you idiot." I understand. I'm sorry. I didn't mean it that way. I'm just going off what he said.
Yeah, I think what like a good point here is that environment, culture, date, time, super relevant, and helps you kind of like understand why there's so many differences within Allah or Yahweh or Jesus or Krishna or Buddha. You know, wherever it's coming from, it's
I get the sense that maybe people at different times in history have been a little more collective, like more common things. Like, you need to feed your sheep and I need to feed my sheep. What are we going to do about the sheep problem? I feel like nowadays, if there was a prophet that was going to try to explain the wonders and the glory of Allah, they'd be like, "What's your problem?" It'd be like, "I'm freaking depressed." It'd be like, imagine never being depressed again. Imagine every tear being quenched, and that's what it's like. You know, or I can't make enough money. What if I could tell you you'd be so rich you'd never even you'd forget what money was. You were so rich.
Yeah.
That's how fulfilled you would be. Whatever the thing is, wherever it meets you at, wherever your secret pain is, God, Allah has got the solve for that.
Yeah.
For that pain that you've got. That's what Allah is like. I feel like that's the point.
Yeah.
Is that is the damn point of it, and that over the years he's just emphasizing that it would have been explained maybe a little differently thousands of years ago.
Yeah.
Compared to how it would be explained now.
Yeah.
The world was a lot less globalized. The problem is that people cling to spiritual tradition. They try to take a spiritual tradition that is thousands of years old, and they try to maintain it as an orthodoxy. They try to maintain it and apply it to today. But today is different. In 1,000 years, a lot of stuff changes. We learn more stuff. We get new developments in science. We get globalization happening. We get new technologies. We get changes in morality. We get changes in values and culture, changes in government, radical, radical, radical changes. We get changes even in our DNA, in our genetics, in the functioning of our brains, our brain chemistry. We get changes in the food that we eat, the air that we, like so many changes. Almost everything has changed. We also have a much deeper historical context into which to put the spiritual traditions. So in a sense, society has evolved. So what really needs to happen is that these spiritual traditions also need to evolve. They need to be fresh, because spirituality is about the present moment, the truth. The truth is only happening in the present. How do you connect yourself with the truth? To answer that question, you must ask first the question, what are the obstacles that are preventing me from connecting to the truth? And what are the obstacles? The obstacles are usually the social ones, the cultural ones. It's your social upbringing, your culture, your education that gets in the way. So the obstacles that existed 1,500 years ago in Arabia are different obstacles than exist today in 21st century America, for example, where people are jerking off to porn and watching YouTube videos nonstop and playing video games. That shit, those obstacles did not exist back then. So a lot of the corruption stems from the mind being ideological and wanting to cling to tradition and not letting these traditions evolve as they need to. This is a problem that's not just exclusive to Islam. It's also there in Christianity, in Judaism. It's even there in science. You think science and atheism is immune to this? Not at all. It suffers from exactly the same problem. Atheists cling to their dogmas, and scientists cling to their paradigms just as much. And a lot of problems get created because of that. You have to understand that
that's right.
600 AD Arabia was very conservative, very traditional. It was extremely tribal. It was very combative. There was no unifying element at that time within Arabia. And so Islam was actually a huge innovation at that time. It brought peace and stability to the region that otherwise was slitting each other's throats over family feuds that went back hundreds and maybe thousands of years, that you were killing and slaughtering your family members in these feuds in that era without even know why you're slaughtering them. You're just slaughtering them just because that's what your culture was at the time. And people were worshiping different deities in that region. There was no unifying force, and there was no notion of peace and compassion and love. And you might think, well, but Islam doesn't teach about peace and compassion and love, because today we know Islam as this sort of violent tradition. But back then, you have to understand that it's all relative. So back then, the violence was so extreme that what Islam actually brought was a stabilizing and peaceful influence. It actually taught that there's something larger that's connecting all of these tribes together. And so under this banner, Muhammad was actually able to unify the entire region. And that was a huge technological innovation at the time. See, we tend to forget, we think of technology as machines and cars and computers and internet and smartphones. That's today's technology. But some of the biggest innovations in technology weren't machines. They were social innovations. They were cultural innovations. They were spiritual, religious innovations. And Islam was one of those at that time. Now, of course, today, when you bring that technology into today without adjusting it, without knowing how to read its intent, how to take the truth out of it, but leave behind the old, antiquated things in the Quran, for example, which don't make sense today. If you're a literalist, if you're too literal about following the Quran, if you're too orthodox about it, then what's going to happen is you're going to bring that culture and the problems of 600 AD Arabia into today's world, and that doesn't work. So the problem is that you have to let these traditions evolve. And the mind has a big problem with evolution, because the whole point of the ego is to prevent evolution. What is ego? Ego is just a structure that's trying to maintain itself as it is. So by definition, any change that comes to this structure, the ego is going to reject, and it's going to bristle at, it's going to feel afraid of, and it's going to want to be orthodox. It's going to want to stay the same. But then, of course, all of life is always changing, so you don't really have an option to stay the same. Everything is going to change. Everything is going to evolve. You're not going to maintain your orthodoxies. And the more you try to maintain your orthodoxies, the more it actually backfires on you. Which is much smarter is to be proactive about evolving along with the times. And also, if you want to maintain the spirit of your orthodoxies and your traditions, you can do that. But to do that, you have to read between the lines and see what the intent, the spiritual heart and core and the intent was of the teaching, which is what this episode is about. If you've got the heart of Islam, you don't need to follow the Quran to the letter. It doesn't matter at all. You can throw the Quran away. When you've got the heart, when you become Allah, it doesn't matter. You don't need to read the Quran anymore, ever. Now, to many Muslims, that will sound like sacrilege, like heresy. That's because that's what orthodoxy is. That's what happens when you take spiritual scriptures too literally. That's always been the problem. Christians have taken spiritual scriptures too literally. Hindus have, and Jews and everybody else. It's just a common problem because the egoic mind, the selfish mind, it's materialistic. It wants to find authority figures that it can latch onto because that's how it gets a sense of its reality and stability. Whereas to awaken is to realize that there is no stability at all, that Allah is infinitely groundless, that there's no beginning or end to it, and that there's no foundation to anything, and therefore you're completely liberated. And ironically, that's what many religious people are afraid of, because remember how the religion was sold in the first place. It was sold to billions and millions of people by watering it down, by making it palatable to the ego. And in a sense, the devil has co-opted the teaching precisely so that it leads you in the exact opposite direction of awakening.
You know, I know that I get a little intense sometime on this show, and I get intense with you. One day we'll fully divulge our secret conversations off camera. But what he just said there, the idea of watering things down, that's scary to me, is making something too palatable for people. I know I can be intense. I know this video is intense for people.
Yeah.
But when you're pursuing the truth, it's like, man, we don't got much time to get to the present and just be like, oh, fuck, thank God we're all here.
Yeah.
Let's celebrate.
Yeah.
People waste forever not doing it, not just grasping it and letting it go.
Yeah. You probably feel relieved because Leo here is kind of taken part of the.
He's being intense for me, because that's sometimes how you want it to be. Because I live in the world and I've got lots of people I love and care about and I'm around all the time, and I would love to hear some other enlightened people talk about it. If we find it, that would be a great thing to react to. Is the idea of falling back. It's the thing he talked about earlier, falling back asleep based on your situation, getting pulled back into gossip and drama and
how he was mentioning the 5 pillars of Islam, the constant engagement of trying to connect with Allah, staying conscious, staying aware. But anyway, that ends it for part 2. We've made it through part 2. So we're 2/3 of the way through this. We'll end it with the last video coming up in the not too distant future. Hopefully we'd love to hear, some of your awesome comments like last time. And keep it coming.
Thanks for staying tuned. Thanks for staying with us
on this
one.
If you made it this far, you're probably
give yourself a pat on the back.
You're doing good. So hopefully you're enjoying it. If you do, don't forget to hit the like, subscribe, share this with a friend, and everyone. Till next time, stay spiritual.